Welcome to Grown Up Storytime. Today, I'm going to read to you from Borders of Infinity by Lois McMaster Bujold. This is a series of short novellas set into a context as a book. But the story that I'm going to read to you is called The Mountains of Mourning. The Mountains of Mourning. Miles heard the woman weeping as he was climbing the hill from the long lake. He hadn't dried himself after his swim, as the morning already promised shimmering heat. Lake water trickled cool from his hair onto his naked chest and back, more annoyingly down his legs from his ragged shorts. His leg braces chafed on his damp skin as he pistoned up the faint trail through the scrub, military double time, his feet squished in his old wet shoes. He slowed curiously as he became conscious of the voices. The woman's voice grated with grief and exhaustion. "Please, Lord, please, all I want is my justice." The front gate guard's voice was irritated and embarrassed. I'm no lord. Come on, get up, woman. Go back to the village and report it at the district magistrate's office. I tell you, I just came from there. The woman did not move from her knees as Miles emerged from the bushes and paused to take in the tableau across the paved road. The magistrate's not to return for weeks. Weeks! I walked 4 days to get here. I only have a little money. A desperate hope rose in her voice, and her spine bent and straightened as she scrabbled in her skirt pocket and held out her cupped hands to the guard. A mark and 20 pence. It's all I have, but... The exasperated guard's eyes fell on Miles, and he straightened abruptly, as if afraid Miles might suspect him of being tempted by so pitiful a bribe. Be off, woman, he snapped. Miles quirked an eyebrow and limped across the road to the main gate. What's this all about, Corporal? He inquired easily. The guard corporal was on loan from Imperial Security and wore the high-necked dress screens of the Barian service. He was sweating and uncomfortable in the bright morning light of this southern district, but Miles fancied he'd be boiled before he'd undo his collar at this post. His accent was not local. He was a city man from the capital, where a more or less efficient bureaucracy absorbed such problems as the one on her knees before him. The woman now was local, and more than local. She had backcountry written all over her. She was younger than her strained voice had first suggested, tall, fever-red from her out weeping, with stringy and protuberant gray eyes. If she were cleaned up, fed, and rested, happy and confident, she might achieve a near prettiness. But she was far from that now, despite her remarkable figure, lean but full-breasted. No. Miles revised himself as he crossed the road and came up to the gate. Her bodice was all blotched and with dried milk leaks. There was no baby in sight, only temporarily full-breasted. Her worn dress was factory-woven cloth, but hand-sewn, crude and simple. Her feet were bare, thickly calloused, cracked, and sore. No problem, the guard assured Miles. Go away, he hissed at the woman. She lurched off her ears and sat stonily. I'll call my sergeant, the guard eyed her warily, and have her removed. Wait a moment, said Miles. She stared up at Miles from her cross-legged posture, clearly not knowing whether to identify him as Hope or not. His clothing, what there was of it, offered her no clue as to what he might be. The rest of him was all too plainly displayed. He jerked up his chin and smiled thinly. Too large head, too short neck, back thickened with its crooked spine, crooked legs with their brittle bones too oft broken, drawing the eye in their gleaming chromium braces. Were the hill woman standing, the top of his head would be barely even with the top of her shoulder. He waited in boredom for her hand to make the backcountry hex sign against evil mutations, but it only jerked and clenched into a fist. I must see my Lord Count, she said in an uncertain point, halfway between Miles and the guard. "It's my right. My daddy, he died in the service. It's my right." "The Prime Minister, Count Vorkosigan," said the guard stiffly, "is on his country estate to rest. If he were working, he'd be back in Vorber Sultana." The guard looked like he wished he were back in Vorber Sultana. The woman seized the pause. "You're only a city man. He's my count, my right." "What do you want to see Lord Count Vorkosigan for?" asked Miles patiently. "Murder," growled the girl woman. The security guard spasmed slightly. "I want to report a murder." "Shouldn't you report to your village speaker first?" inquired Miles, with a hand-down gesture to calm the twitching guard. "I did. He'll do nothing." Rage and frustration cracked her voice. "He says it's over and done. He won't write down my accusation. Says it's nonsense. It would only make trouble for everybody, he says. I don't care. I want my justice." Miles frowned thoughtfully, looking the woman over. The details checked, corroborated her claimed identity, added up to a solid, if subliminal, sense of authentic truth, which perhaps escaped the professionally paranoid security man. "It's true, Corporal," Miles said. "She has the right to appeal, first to the district magistrate, then to the Count's court, and the district magistrate won't be back for 2 weeks." This sector of Count Vorkosigan's native district had only one overworked district magistrate, who made a circuit that included the lakeside village of Vorkosigan-Sirlo but 1 day a month. Since the region of the Prime Minister's country estate was crawling with imperial security when the great lord was in residence, and closely monitored even when he was not, prudent troublemakers took their troubles elsewhere. "Scanner and letter in," said Miles, "on my authority." The guard was one of imperial security's best, trained to look for assassins in his own shadow. He now looked scandalized and lowered his voice to Miles. "Sir, if I let every country lunatic wander the estate at will—" "I'll take her up. I'm going that way." The guard shrugged helplessly, but stopped short of saluting. Miles was definitely not in uniform. The gate guard pulled a scanner from his belt and made a great show of going over the woman. Miles wondered if he'd been inspired to harass her with a strip search without Miles' inhibiting presence. When the guard finished demonstrating how alert, conscientious, and loyal he was, he palmed open the gate's lock, entered the transaction, including the woman's retina scan, into the computer monitor, and stood aside in a pose of rather pointed parade rest. Miles grinned at the silent editorial, steered the bedraggled woman by the elbow through the gates and up the winding drive. She twitched away from his touch at the earliest opportunity, yet still refrained from superstitious gestures, eyeing him with a strange and hungry curiosity. Time was, such openly repelled fascination with the peculiarities of his body had driven Miles to grind his teeth. Now he could take it with a serene amusement, only slightly tinged with acid. They would learn, all of them. They would learn. "Do you serve Count Vorkosigan, little man?" she asked cautiously. Miles thought about that for a moment. "Yes," he answered finally. The answer was, after all, true on every level of meaning but the one she'd asked it. He quelled the temptation to tell her he was the court jester. From the look of her, this one's troubles were much worse than his own. She had apparently not quite believed in her own rightful destiny, despite her mulish determination at the gate. For as they climbed unimpeded toward her goal, a nascent panic made her face even more drawn and pale, almost ill. "How do I talk to him?" she choked. "Should I curtsy?" She glanced down at herself as if conscious for the first time of her own dirt and sweat and squalor. Miles suppressed a specious setup, starting with, "Kneel and knock your forehead 3 times on the floor before speaking. That's what the general staff does." And instead, "Just stand up straight and speak the truth. Try to be clear. He'll take it from there." He does not, after all. Miles' lips twitched. Lack experience. She swallowed. 100 years ago, the Vorkosigan summer retreat had been a guard barracks, part of the outlying fortifications of the great castle on the bluff above the village of Vorkosigan-Sirlo. The castle was now a burnt-out ruin, and the barracks transformed into a comfortable, low-stone residence, modernized and remodernized, artistically landscaped and bright with flowers. The arrow slits had been widened into big glass windows overlooking the lake, and comlink antennae bristled from the roof. There was a new guard barracks concealed in the trees downslope, but it had no arrow slits. The man in the brown and silver livery of the Count's personal retainers exited the residence's front door as Miles approached with the strange woman in tow. It was the new man. What was his name? Pym, that was it. "Where's my Lord Count?" Miles asked him. "In the upper pavilion, taking breakfast with milady." Pym glanced at the woman, waited on Miles in a posture of polite inquiry. "Ah, well, this woman has walked 4 days to lay an appeal before the district magistrate's court. The court's not here, but the Count is. So she now proposes to skip the middleman and go straight to the top. I like her style. Take her up, will you?" "During breakfast?" said Pym. Miles cocked his head at the woman. "Have you had breakfast?" She shook her head mutely. "I thought not." Miles turned his hands palm out, dumping her symbolically on the retainer. "Now, yes." "My daddy, he died in the service," the woman repeated faintly. "It's my right." The phrase seemed as much to convince herself as anyone else now. Ping was, if not a hillman, district-born. "So it is," he sighed, and gestured her to follow him without further ado. Her eyes widened as she trailed him around the house, and she glanced back nervously over her shoulder at Miles. "Little man?" "Just stand straight," he called to her. He watched her round the corner, grinned, and took the steps 2 at a time into the residence's main entrance. After a shave and cold shower, Miles dressed in his own room overlooking the long lake. He dressed with great care, as great as he's expended on the service academy ceremonies and imperial review 2 days ago. Clean underwear, long-sleeved cream shirt, dark green trousers with the side piping, high-collared green tunic tailor-cut to his own difficult fit. Now pale blue plastic ensigns rectangles aligned precisely on the collar and poking most uncomfortably into his jaw. He dispensed with the leg braces and pulled on a mirror-polished boots to the knee and swiped a bit of dust from them with his pajama pants, ready to hand on the floor where he dropped them before going swimming. He straightened and checked himself in the mirror. His dark hair hadn't even begun to recover from that last cut before the graduation ceremonies. A pale, sharp-featured face, not too much dissipated bag under the grey eyes, nor too bloodshot. Alas, the limits of his body compelled him to stop celebrating well before he could hurt himself. Echoes of the late celebration still boiled up silently in his head, crooking his mouth into a grin. He was on his way now, had his hand clamped firmly around the lowest rung of the highest ladder on the barrier. Imperial service itself. There were no giveaways in the service, even for the sons of the old war. You got what you earned. His brother officers could be relied on to know that, even if outsiders wondered. He was in a position at last to prove himself to all doubters. Up and away and never look down. Never look back. One last look back. As carefully as he dressed, Miles gathered up the necessary objects for his task. The white cloth rectangles of his former academy cadet's rank. The hand calligraphied second copy, purchased for this purpose, of his new officer's commission in the Bavarian Imperial Service. A copy of his academy 3-year scholastic transcript on paper, with all its commendations and demerits. No point in anything but honesty in this next transaction. In a cupboard downstairs he found the brass brazier and tripod, wrapped in its polishing cloth, and a plastic bag of very dry juniper bark, chemical fire sticks. Out the back door and up the hill, the landscaped path split, right going up to the pavilion overlooking it all, left forking sideways to a garden-like area surrounded by a low fieldstone wall. Miles let himself in by the gate. "Good morning, crazy ancestors," he called, then quelled his humor. It might be true, but lacked the respect due the occasion. He walked over and around the graves until he came to the one he sought, knelt, and set up the brazier and tripod, humming. The stone was simple. General Count Pyotr Pierre Verkosygin, and the dates. If they tried to list all the accumulated honors and accomplishments, they'd have had to go to microprint. He piled in the bark, the very expensive papers, the cloth bits, a clipped mat of dark hair from that last cut. He set it alight and rocked back on his heels to watch it burn. He'd played 100 versions of this moment over in his head over the years, ranging from solemn public orations with musicians in the background to dancing naked on the old man's grave. He'd settled on this private and traditional ceremony, played straight, just between the two of them. "So, grandfather," he purred at last, "and here we are after all. Satisfied now?" At the chaos of the graduation ceremonies behind, all the mad efforts of the last 3 years, all the pain came to this point. But the grave did not speak, did not say, "Well done, you can stop now." The ashes spelled out no messages. There were no visions to be had in the rising smoke. The brazier burned down all too quickly. Not enough stuff in it, perhaps. He stood and dusted his knees in the silence and the sunlight. So what did he expect? Applause? Why was he here in the final analysis? Dancing at a dead man's dreams? Who did his service really serve? Grandfather? Himself? Pale Emperor Gregor? Who cared? "Well, old man," he whispered, then shouted, "Are you satisfied yet?" The echoes rang from the stones. A throat cleared behind him, and Miles whirled like a scalded cat, heart pounding. My lord," Pym said carefully, pardon me, I did not mean to interrupt anything, but the Count your father requires you to attend on him in the upper pavilion." Pym's expression was perfectly bland. Miles swallowed and waited for the scarlet heat he could feel in his face to recede. "Quite," he shrugged. "The fire's almost out. I'll clean it up later. Don't let anyone else touch it." He marched past Pym and didn't look back. The pavilion was a simple structure of weathered silver wood, open on all 4 sides to catch the breeze. This morning, a few faint puffs from the west. Good sailing on the lake this afternoon, maybe. Only 10 days' precious home leave left, and much Miles wanted to do, including the trip to Walbert Sultana with his cousin Ivan to pick out his new light flyer. And then his first assignment would be coming through. Ship duty, Miles prayed. He'd had to overcome a major temptation not to ask his father to make sure it was ship duty. He would take whatever assignment, comfortable old chairs and tables, one of which bore the remains of a noble breakfast. Miles mentally marked 2 lonely-looking oil cakes on a crumb-scattered tray as his own. Miles's mother, lingering over her cup, smiled across the table at him. Miles's father, casually dressed in an open-throated shirt and shorts, sat in a worn armchair. Errol Verkosygin was a thick-set, gray-haired man, heavy-jawed, heavy-browed, scarred. A face that lent itself to savage caricature. Miles had seen some in opposition press in the histories of Berrier's enemies. They had only to draw one lie, to render dull those sharp, penetrating eyes, to create everyone's parody of a military dictator. And how much is he haunted by grandfather, Miles wondered. He doesn't show it much, but then he doesn't have to. Admiral Errol Verkosygin, space master strategist, conqueror of Comar, hero of Escobar, for 16 years imperial regent and supreme power on Berriar in all but name. And then he capped it, confounded history and all self-sure witnesses, and heaped up honor and glory beyond all that had gone before by voluntarily stepping down and transferring command smoothly to Emperor Gregor upon his majority. Not that the prime ministership hadn't made a dandy retirement from the regency, and he was showing no signs yet of stepping down from that. And so Admiral Errol's life took General Piotr's like an overpowering hand of cards, And where did that leave Ensign Miles, holding 2 deuces and the Joker? He must surely either concede or start bluffing like crazy. The hill woman sat on a hassock, a half-eaten oil cake clutched in her hands, staring open-mouthed at Miles in all his power and polish. As he caught and returned her gaze, her lips pressed closed and her eyes lit. Her expression was strange. Anger? Exhilaration? Embarrassment? Glee? Some bizarre mixture of it all. And who did you think I was, woman? Being in uniform, showing off his uniform, Miles came to attention before his father. Sir, Count Farquharson spoke to the woman. That is my son. If I sent him as my voice, would that satisfy you? Oh, she breathed, her mouth widening down into a fierce, wide grin, the most expression Miles had seen on her face. Yes, my lord. Very well, it will be done. What will be done? Miles wondered warily. The Count was leaning back in his chair, looking satisfied himself, but with a dangerous tension around his eyes, hinting that something had aroused his true anger. Not anger at the woman. Clearly they were in some sort of agreement, and Miles searched his conscience quickly. Not at Miles himself. He cleared his throat gently, cocking his head and baring his teeth in an inquiring smile. The Count steepled his hands and spoke to Miles at last. A most interesting case. I can see why you sent her up. Ah, said Miles. What had he got hold of? He'd only greased the woman's way through security on a chaotic impulse, for God's sake, and to tweak his father at breakfast. He continued noncommittally. Count Farquharson's brows rose. Did you not know? She spoke of a murder and a marked lack of cooperation from her local authorities about it. Figured you'd give her a lift on the district magistrate. The Count settled back further and rubbed his hand thoughtfully across his scarred chin. It's an infanticide case. Miles' belly went cold. I don't want anything to do with this. Well, that explained why there was no baby to go with the breasts. Unusual for it to be reported. We fought the old customs for 20 years in more, said the Count. Promulgated, propagandized. In the cities we've made good progress. In the cities, murmured the Countess, people have all access to alternatives. But in the back country, well, little has changed. We all know what's going on, but without a report, a complaint, and with the family invariably drawing together to protect its own, it's hard to get leverage. What? Miles cleared his throat, nodded at the woman. What was your baby's mutation? The cat's mouth, the woman dabbled out her upper lip to demonstrate. She had the hole inside her mouth too, and was a weak sucker. She choked and cried, but she was getting enough, she was. Harelip, the Count's off-world wife murmured half to herself, translating the Beriarian turn to the galactic standard. And a cleft palate sounds like. Hera, that's not even a mutation. They had that back on old Earth. A normal birth defect, if that's not a contradiction in terms. Not a punishment for your Berarian ancestors' pilgrimage to the fire. A simple operation could have corrected. Countess Farquharson cut herself off. The hill woman was looking anguished. I'd heard, the woman said. My lord had made a hospital to be built at Hadassah. I meant to take her there when I was a little stronger, though I had no money. Her arms and legs were sound. Her head was well shaped. Anyone could see. Surely they would have. Her voice, hands clenched and twisted. Her voice went ragged. But Lem killed her first. A 7-day walk, Miles calculated, from the deep Dandari mountains to the lowland town of Hadassah. Reasonable that a woman newly risen from childbed might delay that hike a few days. An hour's ride in an air car. So one is reported as a murder at last, said Count Farquharson, and we will treat it exactly that. This is a chance to send a message to the farthest corners of my own district. You, Miles, will be my voice, to reach where it has not reached before, You will dispense Count's justice upon the man, and not quietly either. It's time for the practices that brand us barbarians to galactic eyes to end. Miles gulped. Wouldn't the district magistrate be better qualified? The Count smiled slightly. For this case, I can think of no one better qualified than yourself. The messenger and the message all in one. Times have changed. Indeed. Miles wished himself elsewhere, anywhere, back sweating blood over his final examinations, for example. He stifled an unworthy wail. My home leave! Miles rubbed the back of his neck. Who is it killed her, little girl? Meaning, who is it I'm expected to drag out, put up against a wall and shoot? My husband, she said tonelessly, looking through the polished silvery floor beds. I knew this was going to be messy. She cried and cried, the woman went on, and wouldn't go to sleep, and not nursing well. He shouted at me to shut her up. Then, Miles prompted, sick at his stomach, he swore at me and went to sleep at his mother's. He said at least a working man could sleep there. I hadn't slept either. This guy sounds like a real winner. Miles had an instant picture of him, a bull of a man with a bullying manner. Nevertheless, there was something missing in the climax of the woman's story. The Count had picked up on it too. He was listening with total attention, his strategy session look, a slit-eyed intensity of thought you could mistake for sleepiness. That would be a grave mistake. Were you an eyewitness? He asked deceptively. Mild tone that put Miles on full alert. Did you actually see him kill her? I found her dead in the mid-morning, Lord. You went into the bedroom? Count Verkosigan led her on. We've only got one room. She shot him a look as if doubtful for the first time of his total omniscience. She had slept at last. I went out to get some brilberries up the ravine way, and when I came back, I should have taken her with me, but I was so glad that she slept at last. I didn't want to risk waking her. Tears leaked from the woman's tightly closed eyes. I let her sleep when I came back. I was glad to eat and rest, but I began to get full. Her hand touched her breast, and I went to wake her. What? Were there no marks on her? Not a cut throat? Asked the Count. That was the usual method for these backcountry infanticides, quick and clean compared to, say, exposure. The woman shook her head. Smothered, I think, Lord. It was cruel, something cruel. The village speaker said I must have overlain her and wouldn't take my plea against Lem. I did not. She had her own cradle. Lem made it with his own hands when she was still in my belly. She was close to breaking down. The Count exchanged a glance with his wife, a small tilt of his head. Countess Verkosigan rose smoothly. Come, Hera, down to the house. You must wash and rest before Miles takes you home. The hill country woman was taken aback. Oh, not in your house, lady. Sorry, it's the only one I've got handy. Besides the guard barracks. The guards are good boys, but you'd make them uncomfortable. The Countess eased her out. It is clear, said Count Verkosigan as soon as the women were out of earshot, that you will have to check out the medical facts before popping off. And I trust you will also have noticed the little problem with a positive identification of the accused. This could be the ideal public demonstration case we want, but not if there's any ambiguity about it. No bloody mysteries. I'm not a coroner, Miles pointed out immediately. If one could wriggle off this hook. Quite. You will take Dr. Dia with you. Lieutenant Dia was Prime Minister's physician's assistant. Miles had seen him around, an ambitious young military doctor, in a constant state of frustration because his superior would never let him touch his most important patient. Oh, he was going to be thrilled with this assignment, Miles predicted morosely. He could take his osteo kit with him too, the Count went on, brightening slightly, in case of accidents. How economical, said Miles, rolling his eyes. Suppose your story checks out and we nail this guy. Do I have to personally? One of your liveried men will be your bodyguard, and if the story checks, the executioner. That was only slightly better. Couldn't we wait for the district magistrate? Every judgment the district magistrate makes, he makes in my place. Every sentence his court carries out is carried out in my name. Someday it will be done in your name. It's time you gained a clear understanding of the process. Historically, the Vor may be a military caste, but a warlord's duties were never military ones. No escape. Damn, Miles sighed. Right. Well, we could take the air car, I suppose, and be up there in a couple of hours. Allow some time to find the right hole, drop out of the sky on them, make the message loud and clear, be back before bedtime, get it over with quickly. The Count had that slit-eyed look again. No, he said slowly, not the air car, I don't think. No roads for a ground car up that far, just trails, he added uneasily. Surely his father could not be thinking of... I don't think I'd cut a very impressive figure of Central Imperial Authority on foot, sir. His father glanced up at his crisp dress uniform and smiled slightly. Oh, you don't do so badly. But picture this after 3 or 4 days of beating through the bush, Miles protested. You didn't see us in basic or smell us. I've been there, said the Admiral dryly. But no, you're quite right, not on foot. I have a better idea. Well, that was the first section of Mountains of Mourning by Lois McMaster Bujold. Stay tuned. There are 3 more sections to come. If you're enjoying this, please check again. We look forward to reading it to you.